Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here today. My name is Fabiana Bacchini. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we are bringing our education classes online for you every Monday and Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We are bringing experts from all over Canada to address all your questions and concerns. And also, we've been talking to parents to share the experiences around all the issues that they might be experiencing at home, what is happening in the ICUs across Canada. And every Wednesday, 1 p.m., also Eastern Time, Kate Robinson, who is a psychotherapist and also a mom of two premature girls, is hosting real-time peer support groups. And to join the group, you have to join the Canadian Preemie Parent Support Group here on Facebook. And today we're going to talk about feeding. And I have with me here Maureen Luther, who has a bachelor degree of science and physical therapy from the University of Toronto and her master's of arts in special education. She has received certification in several infant assessment tools, including basic and advanced training in assessment of the quality of general movements. As well, she's certified in neurodevelopmental treatment. She has worked with children with developmental challenges all her professional career. She's a pediatric psychotherapist in the neonatal follow-up clinic at Sunnybrook Health Science Centre in Toronto. Maureen, welcome. This is the second time you have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with the families. And today we're going to talk about an issue and a topic that parents are always asking questions and concern, especially when they transition from the NICU home.
Right.
So I want to start talking to you about that transition piece, because obviously when we are in hospital, babies are on a schedule, we come home with a discharge plan, and then we are home. So what do we do at home? Do you keep the schedule from the hospital, or do you try to set up a new routine for the baby?
Right. And so that's a very good question. You will be sent home with a good plan. And the plan is a plan that works well in the hospital and for when you first go home. So you'll know which type of formula or breast milk to use, how many times you're going to give the baby the bottle or you're going to put to the breast. Generally, it's a Q3 schedule, and they'll probably tell you that you can allow maybe 1 4-hour sleep a night. You'll have a bottle, if that's what you're using, has been decided upon, the nipple's been decided upon, and the position. And that's all very well and good for the hospital. Many of those things are selected because it makes it efficient and easier to do in the hospital. But you'll notice, and you should start to notice, that once you get home, things don't seem to be falling exactly along that schedule. And that's a good thing, because now as your baby is moving beyond term, so beyond that 40-week mark and starting to move into that first month, he sort of wants to start to set his own schedule. And that's a very good thing. It shows us the brain is maturing, the baby's getting stronger. And maybe the first thing you notice is maybe the nighttime feed when you go and try and wake him up or her up at 3 hours and he's too sleepy, he doesn't want to sleep. So that's why we want you then to move away from that very tight schedule to start moving towards cue-based feeding. So you're really going to let your baby try and set the cues and set the schedule on his own. So it means very much that you feed him when he's waking up, when he's showing that he's hungry. So that's when you feed him. And then when he or she's had enough, she's going to stop feeding. So she's going to give you the cues, and I'll review the cues in a minute, that I've had enough. I'm full. I don't want to eat anymore. And the other thing is you don't want to wake a baby up at night to feed. You want to let them start stretching out that sleeping time. And it's a very important thing. It's a regulation thing in the baby, and it's a sign of brain maturation. And the other thing is we have to start moving away from all that hospital mechanics, the way they did things, the way you were holding your baby, the way you were holding the bottle, the way you were doing things with the bottle. You want to move towards now what's regular baby feeding. And so one of the things I keep talking about is cue-based feeding. So what we mean by that is you're really watching your baby, and the cues are based on baby movements, facial expressions, sometimes a little bit about the breathing, sometimes how they're handling the liquid. So especially in the first few months prior to solids, the one thing is we don't want messy feeding. We'll talk about when messy feedings are good in a bit of time, But messy, feeding a bottle shouldn't be messy. The baby shouldn't look like, as I make the joke, that they've pulled up to McDonald's takeout window, bam, hand him the food, and boom, he gulps it down. The baby should be comfortable feeding. He's dining. He's gone to a nice restaurant and he's taking his time. So many of the things that we set up on the discharge plan is to be a little bit more efficient, get the volumes, get it done in a certain amount of time. But we want to move away from that, as I said. So things that we use to set the plan, especially, and I obviously tend to keep referring more to bottling. You may have started some breastfeeding in the unit. And if that's what you want to do, then you want to keep going with your breastfeeding. Babies often tend to get a little bit more established in their breastfeeding when they get home, and that's perfectly normal, especially the tinier ones. They start to pick up a little bit more at home with their breastfeeding. So you may have a plan where you're breastfeeding and topping up with the bottle, or you may be pumping and then using the bottle. When we talk about bottles, there's all kinds of different bottles. There's all kinds of different nipples. But I want to especially assure you that we could talk about a slow flow nipple, and there is a huge list of nipples that are called slow flow, and none will match the other. So there's a huge variance in what we term a slow flow nipple. And in actual fact, even there's sometimes a huge variance between one company's slow flow nipple and the other within each nipple. So often it's the formula companies, their nipples are a little less reliance in terms of there's more variation in the terms between the different nipples. So if you have a slow flow nipple by a formula company, it's been known that the nipples themselves are very variable in the flow. So it's just something to be aware of. If you're buying a nipple or a bottle from a bottle company, then they tend to be a little less variable in terms of the nipples. The nipples are generally chosen for your baby to match the flow that they can handle. So for instance, in our unit at Sunnybrook, we picked a Dr. Brown, and I'm not pushing any company more than the other because they have a very slow flow nipple, an ultra preemie nipple, and then a preemie nipple. But I know that Avent is doing the same, and we really want to control the flow from the nipple. It's the flow that's really going to stress the babies out. If it's flowing too quickly, that's when you're going to see a lot of cues that are like more stressful. And so stressful cues around that would be those old fingers. Remember, we talked about the fingers coming up in the unit. That's your first sign that they're getting stressed. They're starting to pull away a little bit. Even sometimes their babies are very clever around the mouth, how they can show you that they're a little bit stressed about the flow. They'll either try and close their lips, they're pushing the tongue out, or they actually sort of do more of a chomping and they're not doing that nice effective sucking, or they'll just stop sucking because it's just flowing a little bit too quick. The other, sorry, Fabiana?
Well, because I actually have a question around that, because when are different cues that a baby would give, like, okay, I had enough because I drank enough, or I'm stressed because of the flow? Is there a way that we can identify that piece? Because when we go from straight home, sometimes we get a little confused as parents on that piece.
Right. Okay. So when a baby is, we talk about a hunger cue and a satiation, a full cue. So when a baby's hungry, they tend to be quite tense. Their hands can be closed. Their arms are tight up against the body, and they're really quite alert and really ready to go. As they start to get full, the hands start to open up, the arms start to drop down, they're starting to get a little more sleepy and a little more relaxed. So that would start to give you the clue that we're starting to get full. A baby that's feeding and is starting to get a little bit more stressed, starting to move around a little bit more. So they may have started off quiet, but then the fingers are up, the arms are starting to move, the feet and the legs are starting to move, and they're starting to try and pull back. So that's probably more around the stress that the flow or something about the feed is not going well versus I'm getting full. More you're full, you're a little bit more comfortable, you're a little bit more calm. It's kind of like that drunk baby-like look, that's like, oh, okay, I've had enough and I'm pretty well done. But both sets of cues, and that's an important point, both sets of cues are very important to pay attention to. So, and that's why when I first started to talk, is if you're getting stress cues about something, then maybe something has to be changed, or you're getting the cues that I'm full, then don't worry about how much is in the bottle. It's time to stop. So if you're getting a really active baby pushing and looking a little anxious, it's time to stop and reevaluate maybe what's going on. Maybe we have to pace things. Maybe we have to give them a break. Or if you have a baby that's now starting to really look relaxed and full, it's time to stop because they're full. And it doesn't matter how much is left in here at the point.
Maureen, so when the babies fall asleep on the breast, for instance, do we keep pushing to feed? Do we let them sleep? Because there's a lot of conversation around that. Oh, no, baby has to keep eating.
Right. Okay. So the one thing about breastfeeding, it's totally in a baby's control. So when a baby is breastfeeding, so they do first of all, there is two kinds of sucking. There's non-nutritive or pacifier sucking, and there's nutritive or feeding sucking. And on a breast, the baby will do both. So when they first start to feed, they do non-nutritive or pacifier sucking, and that's like priming the breast. It gets the breast to start. And then as the milk starts to come, then the baby is feeding sucking, nutritive sucking. And you can generally see the difference because the jaw sort of starts to change. When the babies are pacifier sucking, it's more of a faster, bit more of a flutter to the jaw. And when they're feeding, the jaw starts to open up. So, but babies know when they're on the breast so that they're going to pacifier suck, get the milk come, feed along. And then when they start to have had enough, they'll pacifier suck. And that's what pacifiers do, puts me to sleep. So the baby's in control, and that's how you let the baby breastfeed. Take the baby off, baby kind of wakes up. You may then maybe put the baby back on the breast to finish the feed, maybe switch the breast, but they're in control. And that's one of the pluses of breastfeeding. So they'll move between the two sucks very much on their own.
Okay, one more question around that.
Yeah.
So, because obviously now also the appointments are canceled, you're doing a lot of appointments online, and mom wants to make sure baby's eating well and feeding well as much as they need. Because obviously when you leave the hospital, you're concerned about the weight with the baby every day. We wear the diapers to see if there is enough coming out. So what can we do at home to balance that, to make sure baby follows asleep because baby, is satisfied. But, know, as moms and dads, you always worry, is my baby eating enough or having enough?
Yeah. And I think with breastfeeding, that is one of the issues is the baby getting enough? Mommies, premature babies, they know how much they pump because they've been pumping for months, but they're always worried if the baby's going to get enough. So ways that you do know that they're getting enough, you're getting 6 to 8 wet diapers a day. And they're wet, they're soaking, they're heavy, and you're getting bowel movements. Now, bowel movements can change with breastfeeding. At the beginning, you can get frequent bowel movements. Every time you change the diaper, it's a dirty diaper. But then as the baby starts to get a little bit older, sometimes the bowel movements can change because there's not a lot of wastage with breast milk. It's species specific. So they may go a longer period of time without having a bowel movement. So they may go 5 days, 4 days, and that's not really a problem because there's not a lot of wastage with breast milk. But I think the big thing is, are they feeding? Are they satisfied at the end of the feed? They go to sleep. And with breastfeeding, especially, they should be waking every 2.5 hours. So again, they're really not following that initial hospital schedule. They're wanting to eat more frequently. Breast milk moves through the tummy pretty quick. And so they're going to feed more frequently. And so you're going to have frequent feeds. They sleep, they'll sleep for a period of time, then they'll wake up, feed again. And then the wet diapers, the bowel movements, that should all give you the feel that your babies are getting enough. And with the bottle, you actually have the numbers, but again, you don't want to push them beyond their capacity. It's not good to feed a sleeping baby. It's one of the things that, you need to look at. It's fine if they start off feeding and then they're vigorous. And then as they start to get full, you might have a little bit of sleeping, but they're still sucking. So that's a good feed, but you don't want to be trying to feed your baby when sleeping. Baby should be awake. And so with the bottles that they're feeding, again, maybe if it's formula, it's about every 2.5, 3 hours. It's a little easier with a bottle to overfeed them because sometimes we're anxious that you finish the bottle. but sometimes that may be too much for them and they're starting to get full and they're a little bit discomfort with too full a tummy. And then we keep offering the bottle because it does become a way that they kind of calm down because it's the sucking part. So if you think they've had enough, then maybe try a pacifier before you keep trying to feed them again.
Maureen, let's talk about positioning. How
Yep.
do we proper position the baby when they first get discharged, moving on to a few months old, because then we can talk about moving to eating.
Right. Okay. So there are generally 3 types of positions that we choose for bottle feeding. There's 3 basic positions for breastfeeding as well. So probably you've seen there's a favorite position now, especially for the new babies, where we're starting to feed what's called elevated sideline. So the baby is lying on their side. I usually recommend bum to belly, and then it's this way that you're feeding. This way, and a slow flow nipple is the slowest way to control the flow of the bottle. So this elevated sideline, a slow flowing nipple, really slows the flow of the nipple down, the flow from the nipple. Then the next one tends to be, we start to move from here and we sort of move into this semi-reclined position. So it ends up being a favorite position because you're sort of here controlling the head, you can control the trunk. Again, you're sort of holding the bottle like this. It's also important, one way to control the flow is rather than a diagonal hold of the bottle, which makes it flow faster because of gravity, keep it horizontal, and that will also control the flow. And then by about 6 weeks corrected, I think the goal should be, and that's why you don't hear about that coming out of the hospital, because that's not part of where they're thinking about, is that by about 6 weeks corrected, it would be good that if you were feeding your baby in your arm this way. So now you're back into sort of that normal baby feeding position, and now you're feeding like this. One of the reasons for this is that around the 6 week corrected mark, the baby is now wanting to look at you in the eye. So they want to look up at you and they want to become engaged with you. So this is the social part of feeding. This is the final sort of cherry on top of the feeding, is that now I can look at my mommy, I can engage with my mommy, mommy's nice and calm and smiling. And so that starts to calm this whole thing down and really starts to become a nice social feeding kind of thing. It's the same with breastfeeding. So breastfeeding, you know that you're either going to have a football hold, you're going to have the cross cradle hold while you're holding the breast. And then maybe again, by the 6 week mark, you're going to be able to hold your baby like this while breastfeeding. Again, so it's the same idea that the baby wants to then start to look up at their mother. And that's the distance between the breast and the mommy's face that the baby can see around the 6 week mark.
That is wonderful. Maureen, can we talk a little bit about reflux? I know this is a big subject, but we did talk before about, babies that regularly spit up or they really have a reflux. And you said like how the incredible tummy time can help babies with that as well, which was news to me. That I love that information.
So, right. So reflux is basically its contents coming out of the tummy. So, and the reason it happens, especially so much with the premature babies, is that the area at the top of the tummy is just an area of muscle tone. It's not like a flap or a sphincter or anything like that. It's an area of muscle tone. And so in our premature babies, again, just like their tummy muscles, it's a very weak area. So as the food goes in, this little area of muscle opens up, the food goes in, and then it closes when the baby, after the food goes into the tummy. But as the tummy fills, the fluid pushes on this sphincter, this area, and then up the food comes up. All babies spit. Every baby is going to spit. And I always say, that white stripe down your back, it's a badge of honor. You've got a beautiful, healthy baby, and they're spitting down your shoulder. That's no problem. Reflux becomes a problem is if they're getting sick from it, they're not gaining weight, or they're really disliking to eat. But most of our babies will handle the reflux and the spitting up. Medications, the theory behind the medications is it only takes away the discomfort from the spitting up. And there's different ideas if there is discomfort from the spitting up, but it's not going to stop the spitting up, the regurgitation. One of the ways, I think there's a couple of ways to help the spitting up. First of all, small and frequent feeds, so breast, and or bottle. So not to push the volumes, and maybe to feed the baby a little bit more frequently. So that way he's starting to control it. The tummy's not so full, and you're not trying to push in that big 2-3 volume, especially with a bottle. You're going for those shorter, those smaller, more frequent feeds, controlling the flow. Again, that's why I spend a lot of time on talking about bottle, nipples, and position. If the baby's feeding too fast, then they're kind of gulping, and then they're taking in air. You get air in, you get the liquid in there, you have a big burp, and then up it comes. So generally, you control the flow, smaller, more frequent feeds. And then, as we talked about right at the beginning, it's the tummy that's weak. So frequent tummy time. Back to that tummy time. Tummy time is going to help decrease the spitting up because it's going to make the tummy muscles stronger. It's going to help that sphincter get stronger. It also helps the bowel movements because if the baby's not pooing and not getting the stuff out, that also starts to make them feel a little more full and also can contribute to reflux. So I think those are the 3 big easy things, and they're pretty easy, and most of the time they're very successful in helping with reflux.
That is wonderful, but also remind all the parents at home, if they are concerned, always to consult their healthcare provider, right?
Right.
Because it can be some underlying issues that,
yes,
that
yes,
might be worth investigating.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, sorry, that if you should be really enjoying, as a mommy or a daddy, you should be really enjoying feeding your baby, and your baby should enjoying to eat. If you have a sense, or if you're stressed about feeding your baby, or you have a sense that your baby is stressed about feeding, I think that's a good marker that you should reach out and try and get some help. You have the feeling when mommy is feeling stressed about her baby, mommies know, they know. So if you're feeling stressed about feeding, that's when you should reach out for help. Your pediatrician, neonatal follow-up, phone there. Try and get some help from people who know about prems and about feeding, for sure.
Absolutely. Yes. Maureen, let's move to solids now, because this
Yes.
is another big transition from our little guys, right?
Yes.
So now we have this feeding established. Now it's time to move on to real food.
Okay.
So age, are we still on the 4 to 6 months corrected guideline?
Yeah. So generally solids are recommended to start between 4 and 6 months corrected. Us at Sunnybrook, we tend to go around the 5-month mark. Babies are starting to be really aware. You're going to see that they're probably watching you when you're eating. They're getting better head control because you've been doing lots of tummy time. So then that tends to be a good time to start introducing the solids. And one has to remember that it's a learning experience, especially at the beginning. They have to learn about a new utensil. They have to learn about a new texture. So it's very different from this to then when we now move to this. But to get prepared for the introduction of solids, so that's what you want to get. You want to get a couple of spoons because baby's going to have a spoon and you're going to have a spoon. I've also discovered this little spoon. It's a little slotted spoon, if you can see it. And this becomes a great little introduction around 6 months, maybe a little bit older, so that you can dip this in the food and then let them start putting it in their mouth themselves. So it's called a pre-spoon. So this has been a great find. You're going to get your spoons, and you're going to get, if you can, a high chair. Doesn't have to be fancy, but it's something that the baby needs because they're going to need head support and trunk support. And you also want a high chair that's going to have the capacity to have some recline. So initially they're not going to be able to sit straight up. They're going to have probably about 30 degrees of recline. And then if you find when you put your baby in the high chair that they're still sort of all over the place, then just take a little roll and have it down between the armpit and then the hip. And that will keep them nice and steady and straight in the high chair. And then you're going to always position yourself directly in front of your baby, and you're going to be feeding straight on. Because, again, just as when you were bottle feeding, and especially in the hospital, they really wanted you to watch what you were doing, especially at the beginning when you were feeding. This is what you need to do, too, as you're starting to feed your baby by spoon. You're really watching their face, their cues, and you want them to be anticipating the spoon, and then you present it. So you have to pace yourself again as your baby's starting to eat the solids. And now this should be a time when it's very messy. So messy's good here. Messy is learning. So it's going to be all over the place. Baby's going to be grabbing at the spoon. That's why you give them their spoon, switch it off. And then you go from there. The messier it is, then the more the baby will want to put their hands in their mouth and then be involved in the food. With premature babies, the biggest difficulty, I think, with the solids is the textures. Our babies are very sensitive around the mouth. They've had so many things happen around the mouth from the time they were born. And now here we are again at 6 months or so, 5 months corrected, and now we're doing something else to the mouth. So that's usually the biggest issue. It's not so much the taste of the food, it's more the textures. And the recommendations now for introducing solids is you don't have to start with the cereal. So traditionally, we always started with the rice cereal. You don't have to do that so much anymore. You can start with a vegetable. I often say a sweet potato, bake a sweet potato, carve it out, use your formula or that frozen breast milk that's been sitting in the freezer for 6 months or more, and mix that into your sweet potato to make it smooth. And it's always best to make your own food. And one of the reasons to make your own food is the cost, but you will never make it as smooth and as runny as the jars or the pouches, which is a good thing. We want the baby to sort of be using their mouth in a sort of a movement action to start to move the food. And that will also help them move quickly into this more textured food. The smooth purees and the jars and the pouches, they're too smooth. And those foods don't smell like your house. A huge part of eating is flavor, and flavor is smell and taste. And you want the foods to smell like your house. Your house smells delicious. And that's what your babies have smelled. They've smelled that, and they've had that flavor of your diet from the time they were in utero. The amniotic fluid is similar to mommy's diet. So you're delicious. Mommy's delicious. So is the house. It's delicious. And it doesn't smell like those jars that you open up and it's like, what is that? That's not what my house smells like. So use your own foods, make your own food. It's the best thing to do. Make it a little on the thicker pasty side so that the spoon could almost stand up and it's not falling off the spoon and then presenting it to the baby. Pace yourself. When the baby is sort of, anticipating opening their mouth, then you're putting it in. And again, baby starting to close their mouth, look away. Probably the first thing they're going to do is look away because it's like, I'm not so keen on this. And then the big cue is like when they finally turn away and like, oh, I don't want anymore. That's okay. That's okay. Just start off. You're going to start off maybe once a day, try at least 3 little 2 spoons, or then there's those guys who love it. So then move to twice a day. And then by about 8 months, 7 towards 8 months, you want about 3 meals a day. So a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner.
Maureen, before we move on to moving forward with that, I have a question here from somebody's watching live.
Yep.
How do you switch to cue-based only after 40 weeks? Do you switch to cue-based feeding only after 40 weeks?
So cue-based after 40 weeks?
Yeah, so, or before.
Well, so like for instance, we have a little baby right now in our unit who's now getting past 40 weeks because we know sometimes the little microprems are in the unit a little bit more than 40 weeks. Often our little guys that 26 and under, they're here 42, 44 weeks. So sometimes you'll hear the staff or the unit talking about ad lib feeding. So what we mean is that let's try and wait for the baby to wake up to feed. And so that's part of the cue-based feeding. But those little guys, we're kind of dancing there. So we have a little bit of this ad lib, let them feed when they want, but then there's always that caveat. There's always those rules, but you're not going to let them go too long. So you have to see that you've had this schedule, that you've gone home, and it's really moving along quite well. But then you're starting to get the sense the baby's becoming a little bit more mature. Maybe they're waking up a little bit more frequently in the daytime, so you want to feed them a little bit more, and you're having more trouble at night waking them up at the 4-hour mark. So, but you know, every baby's different, and these are just guidelines. So when I talk, it can't be specific about every baby, but you kind of get the feel when you can go a little bit more cue-based versus that schedule. So the first couple of weeks at home, you're going to follow the schedule, and then the baby will start to kind of give you the sense that maybe you can move a little bit more to cue-based.
Okay. Thank you, Maureen.
Yeah.
Also, I want to, before we wrap it up, I want to talk about self-feeding, because we talk about, you know, baby about around 9 months, you can self-feed.
Yeah.
How is that next transition?
Okay. So self-feeding, you can sort of start even by 7 months, but because we have all these wonderful, you know, crunch and melt textures. So the baby mums, those little pops, Cheerios, these little cheesy looking things. And that's a good beginning, and they're pretty safe. So if you even taste them yourself, as soon as you put them in your mouth, the saliva is already melting them down. And then that's how they start to introduce with the self-feeding. The other thing too is what you want to do when you're spoon feeding, you want to stick to the same texture. So what you're trying to get to is you may start off with a bit of a paste, and then you want to get a little bit thick, but you want to keep your textures the same. So you don't want to have a thick texture with a lump inside, because that tends to freak them out, because they kind of know what to do with the thick texture, but the lump is going to surprise them when they move it back in the mouth. So we don't mix the textures. So no soups or stews or anything. You make it all one texture. And I usually recommend, so you've got this thicker texture that's on the spoon, and then the little soft lumps are on the tray. So little soft pieces of, you've done the crunch and melt. So then you'll start with the little soft pieces of banana, the little soft pieces of avocado, shredded cheese can be another good self-feeding from the bags, soft cooked rice. Those are all great things. And you should be introducing these, as I said, about 7 months. And by the time you're moving towards 9 months, you're starting to put more and more stuff on the tray. The goal by about 12 months is it's all your own family foods, and there's lots of self-feeding. And as I said, it's super messy. The tray is a mess. And the other thing that's important about feeding, I mean, this is a topic that we could go on and on about, is it's a social thing. So it should be chatting, talking, mommy, daddy, baby, and it's not a time to be distracting. So if you find that you have to distract a lot, then you sort of have to maybe help somebody reevaluate what's going on, because are you distracting because you're getting stressed about the feeding? So then remember I said stress is a barometer where you may need to reach out for help. But you don't want to use screens, you don't want to use TV, you don't want to do all of that. Especially as we start to move to the 1 year mark. There's a wonderful woman who does lots of things around feeding, and her name is Ellen Satter, and she talks about the division of responsibility. And that really comes into play as we move closer to the 1 year mark. Mummies and daddies, they decide where the baby's going to eat, when the baby's going to eat, and what he's going to eat. And the baby's going to decide how much I'm going to eat and if I'm going to eat it. And if I eat a little bit and then I'm throwing the food down, okay, we're done. Down you go. That's enough. And we're not going to distract and try and push past that. So let them down, because that was breakfast. And then there's going to be a snack at about 10 or 10:30. So then you're going to do some cheese or yogurt or things like that. And then there's lunch, and then there's mid-afternoon snack, supper, and a bedtime snack. The bottles amounts, the formulas, or the breast milk starts to diminish as you give more and more food. As you introduce your food, you're going to give the food first and then your bottle or your breastfeeding. And that by the time you get to about 12 months, you're down around about 12 ounces, calculating that times 30 is about 300 and something mLs. Okay? Any more?
No, I think that's it, Maureen. Any final thoughts or?
I just think that feeding should be a lot of fun. It should be so enjoyable from the time you come home, whether you're breastfeeding or bottle feeding. It's such a wonderful time. And then when you start playing with the foods and introducing it and watching their reaction, it should be a fun time. It's a great time to come together. And the other thing too, especially as we start to get them in the high chair and they're starting to self-feed, it's a wonderful learning experience. We know sometimes our prems can be a little short on the attention, But this self-feeding, this feeding, being with your family, it's a wonderful learning activity and a learning moment. So it should be social, fun, learning, oral motor. It involves everything, and it should be a wonderful experience. And if it's not, then try and get some help.
That's wonderful. Maureen, thank you so much for sharing all your word of knowledge with us. We really appreciate that because it's so helpful for all the families. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks.
And thank you everyone for watching at home. I'll be back on Monday. I'll be interviewing Dr. Marcia Campbell from IWK. We're going to be talking about parent involvement in the ICU, how to support your baby during painful procedure, and a new study she's doing at the hospital around COVID-19. So tune in on Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And thank you everyone and have a lovely weekend. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.